Hi BookTube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about T.S. Eliot. So about a week or so ago I made a video, a bit of a rambly video about T.S. Eliot's early poetry, and then today I want to talk a little bit about mainly The Wasteland, and then if we have time, because I want it to be a bit shorter than last time, I want to talk a bit about where his poetry goes after then and sort of leading up to four quartets. I'm making this video and the others because I'm in part of a reading group. We've been reading T.S. Eliot's poetry, and the last 2 weeks we've been looking at the Wasteland, and in each week as we've been looking at different periods of Eliot's writing, I've been sort of reading around some of the other poems from around the same period and after. And so next week we'll be reading four quartets, and so I wanted to sort of fill in the gap between The Wasteland and four quartets. So we'll see where it goes. But we'll start off with The Wasteland and my general impressions of what's going on in The Wasteland, a bit of my history with the poem. So here's my edition, a sort of standalone edition of The Wasteland, which I really love. You may be able to hear that it's really quite creaky. The binding isn't great really, but yeah, I got this along with this copy of George Herbert's The Temple at the same time. And if you want a random memory, a random story, it was I was going to go watch, or well, I go to go listen to a recital of Handel's Messiah with some friends just before Christmas, and I had time to kill before that started, and so I went and picked this up, and I can remember flicking through The Wasteland and the Temple while waiting for my friends to turn up, and this very snooty middle class woman coming up to me asking if I was supposed to be there. I think I might have been dressed a little too scruffily for the venue, but yeah, I can remember that as being the time I picked up The Wasteland, but I wouldn't go on to read it for a few months, and I read it sort of the following summer, so that was Christmas time. It would have been around June of the following year that I read it. And I can remember being quite perplexed by it, as I often was with T.S. Eliot at that point, enjoying the mood and the language, this sense of phantasmagorica of all these elements coming in and out, but not knowing what to do with it and not exactly knowing what's going on, and then just certain details that sort of come up and stay with you. Often these kind of soiled details that, you know, you get a lot in his early poetry with the sawdust and the smell of steaks and the one night cheap hotels, and those, you know, those little details that Eliot likes to put in there to create a mood, like the yellow fog and stuff like that. And there's still plenty of that going on in The Wasteland, particularly in the third section. The bit that stayed with me was these so it's sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed. And so there are actually details of things that aren't there, but are the kind of things that Eliot would think of as being typical of rushing down the Thames on a summer night. I can remember particularly the sandwich papers, for some reason, stuck in my head, and whenever I thought of The Wasteland, I was just imagining this brown, slightly greasy paper, you know, to wrap up the sandwich in. And then I'd go on to read it and read a bit deeper, and I've got a guide to T.S. Eliot that I like going to at least give me a few points here and there. And I think with the Wasteland, One of the great clues are the notes that T.S. Eliot gives you at the end. In many ways, they are a kind of wild goose chase. They're not really answering many questions. But as you get used to the poem and the world of the poem, the notes do become quite helpful in their own way. And he mentions that there are two works that were quite instrumental for him in the composition of the poem. One of them is From Ritual to Romance by Jessie L. Weston, and then Fraser's The Golden Bough, both works on sort of mythology and the symbolism of rituals in mythology. And he says towards the end, anyone who is antiquated with these works will immediately recognise in the poem certain references to vegetation ceremonies. What on earth are vegetation ceremonies? And I, the first time I skipped through the notes, I was thinking, he's just playing with us, or just trying to be, he's just trying to be obscure, or, on purpose, which he kind of is. And yet, then when you think of these societies, of these myths that were being written about in books like The Golden Bough, and these rituals, where who knows what was going on in them, but the kind of consensus being that they're rituals to make the rain to come down, to nourish the earth, so that whatever is down there in the dead earth can spring up. And it's there throughout the mythology. It's there in lots of symbolism in art. It's there in religion, and it's something picked up on by poets. It's something that Walt Whitman and Rilke both wrote about. But then, with that in mind, you then go to the beginning of the poem, with April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. And for one, I just love the way that sounds. It sounds so much more serious, but so much more self-assured, and so much more confident than anything that T.S. Eliot had written up to this point. On the whole, that little introduction, the lines are shorter. I love the way that he is sort of ending with these what do you call them? Breeding, mixing, stirring. So these verbs here with the ing. Anyway, and I love the way they catapult you into the next line. They're less, with his early poetry, feeling like you're just there observing something, or that your Prufrock stood at the threshold waiting to go in, and shall I or not, who knows. Whereas this is much more assertive, and already there we've already got imagery that's connecting with those vegetation ceremonies that he was talking about. So we have the breeding lilacs, we have the dead land, the soil, we have memory and desire, and then the dull roots and the spring rain. And then I love how then the more positive language is used for winter. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. And that's what he prefers, that's what the speaker of the poem prefers, to be kept insulated by the snow, to just have nutrition dribbling down just little by little, and the rain of April is somehow cruel. Or could it be, with the whole idea of the poem being that this is a a dry, barren landscape. It's called the wasteland, and he's sort of slowly through association and through the imagery of the poem, creating this barren landscape. And so it could be that April is the cruelest month, not because in some way any kinds of virility in the landscape and in the soil is viewed negatively, but more that we have the memory and the desire, and it's more the memory of rain when there is no rain that's so cruel. Potentially, who knows? That might just be me misreading things. But anyway, and then later on, and I'll skip forward a bit, but then we have, what are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you only know a heap of broken images, where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And so that's the landscape of the poem. And so we still have, begin it with that question: what are these roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? That sort of rhetorical idea. And we've already had this sort of subterranean land suggested at the very beginning of the poem, with the dry, with the dull roots and the dried tubers. And so there we're given more definitive idea of the landscape of the poem. And then just something I had in the back of my mind this last time I was reading the poem, and this is maybe where I make a little bit of my departure from this idea of actually no, we'll stay with that, thinking about the vegetative ceremonies. So it's like, what is he doing with it? What's going on in there? And I think for me, it's partly just how he saw the world at that time. A world of change, of increased industrialization, a world still in shock and trauma after the First World War, and maybe a world that is becoming more and more secular and more individualistic as well, and there's less of a sense of collective and of society, of all being in there together, and people are increasingly isolated, whether due to their own personal traumas and experiences, or just more generally because of what the world is turning into and what's expected of them. And Eliot's looking at this, he's looking at the way people, even when people interact, and he's seeing it all as kind of barren and of no substance and of being fruitless. And that's our wasteland, and that's our dry soil crying out for rain and for sustenance and for nutrition. And there are no, I don't really think there are any clear answers in the wasteland. He gives you a hint at something that you have to work out, and you have to reconcile it yourself as to whether this is an answer to the question of the poem at the end of what the thunder said. Is it going to help, or isn't it? But the other thing that really stands out to me, and it's something that it stood out to me because Thomas from the channel Art and Literature Matters, and he's the leader of this read through Eliot's poetry. In a video he made, he was just making this plea to be open when reading T.S. Eliot, and so this time through with reading The Wasteland in particular, I didn't want to get too in the weeds, and I just read it through just to see what stood out to me this time through. And what really stood out to me was this idea of being between this moment. It's almost a moment of crisis in the kind of way that St. Augustine would write about, like a fever crisis. It could easily go one way or the other, but at this point we were in the middle. And once I noticed it in The Wasteland, and maybe I'll give you a few instances, but then afterwards I saw it everywhere. So from what I just read you, there was a little bit of it. And I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. So we've been given the two, these two directions, and then with a third is suggested. And then just a little down from there, there's this voice. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence. And just that being neither living nor dead. And that's then throughout the whole poem again, in the third section called the Fire Sermon, there's then this telling of a situation between this woman and this young man where he's making advances on her, and it describes her attitude as so he endeavours to engage her in caresses which still are unreproved if undesired. So she doesn't put up any defences, doesn't say anything about it, but deep down it's undesired. So it's a very uncomfortable situation, and then afterwards all she can say about it is, well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again, alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. And so her automatic hand, the sense that, again, someone who's not living or dead, and whether due to trauma or something else, is kept from being able to reprove, to defend herself, to say what she really wants, to say when something's happening that she doesn't want to be happening, to comment on that, and instead, even her moments when alone, her automatic hand, her being just almost an automata, another machine like the gramophone. And so again, someone in this kind of in-between state, in this kind of limbo, and they can't get out of it. And so that's just one of the betweens that I noticed. And then I was just noticing it in his poetry all the way through, particularly with, the next poem, The Hollow Men, is full of betweens. And I love that, again, The Wasteland is describing a place of this dry place. In The Hollow Men, it's almost like trying to get to a place, trying to imagine a place. There's this constant mentioning of a kingdom, and we first hear of it being called Death's Other Kingdom, and shortly later, Death's Dream Kingdom. and then Death's Doom Kingdom again, and then a Twilight Kingdom, and on and on and on. And then at the end of the poem, I'll just read the last part of the Hollow Men. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom, for thine is life is, for thine is this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. I love the way, he's bringing in the Lord's Prayer, and then the sort of ironic life is very long there, and then it being sort of broken down, the sense of maybe someone not being able to say what they're saying, but also with this, for thine is the kingdom, being contrasted with this kingdom of death, or maybe they're the same thing, or this twilight kingdom, again a between state, not light or dark. And then between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. So we have this word between being our, this kind of anaphora going on, and then falls the shadow. And my question reading the Hollow Men this time through was, the shadow of what? Is it the shadow of the kingdom, the shadow of death, the shadow of something else entirely? And it's something that, with the Wasteland, although there's tons going on, there are loads of references, it keeps changing voices. There are usually details, and things and scenes and objects to really cling on to, and there are these each little bit of the poem is like a little room that you can live in and try to piece together. And I feel like between writing The Wasteland and writing 4 quartets, which hopefully I'll be able to talk about next week, he's in this place where the poetry becomes much more abstract, right? And so I'm suddenly having to ask these questions like, the shadow of what? What are you talking about? And still, I think particularly with the Hollow Men and Ash Wednesday, there's still something very stirring in the poetry itself, and maybe the aim of the poetry is more to build a mood, and a kind of emotion, to provoke some kind of reaction in the reader, rather than to throw all of these various experiences and scenes and quotations and things at you to work out. So it's more experiential and maybe a little less academic and referential than something like The Wasteland, which just makes The Wasteland shine out all the more for me. I love 4 quartets, and 4 quartets is very abstract, and yet for me it is the best thing that T.S. Eliot wrote. But at the end, I think when it comes to reading T.S. Eliot, I have the most fun reading The Wasteland. And so I'll leave it there. Hopefully more of a little rambly love letter to this brilliant, eccentric work that just shines really brightly right in the middle of T.S. Eliot's career. So I hope you found that interesting, and hopefully we'll be back for some more rambles about T.S. Eliot in a week or so. So for now, yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.